The Nuremberg Trials are one of the key events in human history. In 1921, following the results of the First World War, only ordinary perpetrators for war crimes were tried in Leipzig, while generals were excluded from the list of accused. However, things went differently in Nuremberg. For the first time, the international community has pronounced a verdict on the leaders of an entire state that unleashed the bloodiest war in history. This process condemned not only individual episodes of the war, but also crimes against peace and humanity. Despite the opinions of historians that not all perpetrators were punished, the Nuremberg Trials remained significant. It has evolved from the original idea of an impartial international process to the embodiment of the political interests of the great powers, yet the facts show that this event was of great importance. In addition to the trial, the Nuremberg Trials had an impact on culture. Many books have been written about it, and even a film is being released that allows us to look at history through the prism of the life of a military translator, exploring not only the case of his brother, but also facing the Nazi underground. It all started with the choice of a place for the trial of Germany, which was already a political game. The Allies agreed to a joint process after the Moscow Conference in 1943, abandoning unilateral approaches. In this process, it was fixed that those who committed crimes without reference to a specific place would be judged by the international community. Although domestic political interests may have influenced the course of the trial, the Nuremberg Trials remained an important stage in the history of trials, designed to punish the main perpetrators of war crimes and emphasize the importance of international legality. Each of the victorious countries excluded controversial issues from discussion, such as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and racial segregation in the United States. In the case of Germany, the venue was also important. Like a symbol, the court was placed in Berlin, a city that was significant in the final stages of World War II. In this regard, a real race for influence began between Churchill and Eisenhower. As early as April 1945, they were exchanging letters expressing their desire to meet with Soviet representatives as far east as possible. The USSR, in turn, expressed similar wishes. For some time, the initiative was on the side of Britain and the United States. All the same, the path from Normandy to Berlin was much closer. During this period, Operation Market Garden was carried out, which became the largest landing in history, and at the same time the last major victory of the Wehrmacht in the war. However, after this operation, the Allies abandoned the storming of Berlin. This move, decided by President Eisenhower, is still considered the strangest in American textbook history. Thus, Berlin went to the USSR and became the center of the Nuremberg Trials. But, as you might guess from the name, the formal center. The first meeting was held there on October 18, but the main trial was moved to Nuremberg. This was due to the fact that Nuremberg was the center of the Innstat Party congresses, and suitable buildings were preserved there. In reality, it was a compromise. Nuremberg was in the zone of American occupation, and the victorious powers agreed on the choice of two cities for the trial. But they faced a difficult task: who to judge, and what exactly to deal with. This question has caused difficulty for hundreds of lawyers from a dozen countries with different legal systems and views on the outcome of the war. There lies a dilemma regarding the collective responsibility of the Germans, with the blame placed only on the authorities. The question also arises as to how the actions of the rebels should be considered, half of whose activities in the context of international law also fall under the definition of war crimes. In addition, it should be added that, according to modern opinion, the bombing of Dresden by the United States and Britain can also be included in the category of war crimes. Most historians consider this operation devoid of military meaning. It is also impossible to ignore the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in conjunction with the Munich Agreement, which still raised questions and became the reason for the duration of the Nuremberg Trials, lasting 14 months. During this time, 403 meetings, 216 court hearings were held, 300,000 affidavits were submitted. The protocol of the tribunal's work filled 16,000 pages. The Nuremberg Trials were a legal phenomenon and the first use of a four-language simultaneous translation system on the scale of such a trial. It is interesting to note that it was from Nuremberg that the tradition of lawyers to appeal to emotions and even use gangster slang in legal documents began. An example is the speech of the American prosecutor Robert Jackson, who, instead of purely legal facts, most of the time talked about wars of conquest and crimes against humanity. Even in the USSR, this speech caused delight, and excerpts from it were published in newspapers. On the other hand, Sir Hartley Shawcross of Britain preferred to focus on the dry description of acts of aggression and illegal activities, but his speech has not gone down in history. The defense strategy of the lawyers representing the 24 defendants from Germany consisted mainly of taking Tukuoku at home, at the very stigma, into the canon. They tried to show that the defendants did the same things that their opponents did, but in this case it was considered illegal because of the defeat of Germany. It is interesting to note that many people who, before the Nuremberg trials, were the organizers of all the crimes, suddenly turned up dead or disappeared without a trace. However, on October 1, 1946, out of 24 people were sentenced to death by hanging or shooting. The court only rejected the request of Martin Bormann, Hitler's secretary, because his whereabouts remained unknown. Up until 1972, Bormann's remains were not identified. 3 more of the remaining defendants received sentences of 20 years in prison, 2 of them 15 years, while German Navy Commander Karl Donitz, propagandist Hans Fritzsch, diplomat Franz Papen, and National Bank Director Hjalmar Schacht were acquitted. Naturally, such decisions provoked violent protests from the USSR, but this is just the tip of the iceberg. As a result, the Nuremberg trials failed to prove that the General Staff, the headquarters of the Wehrmacht, and the Imperial Cabinet were independent organizations and, therefore, were not guilty of crimes. In fact, Nuremberg condemned only the SS, the Gestapo, and the leadership of the NSDAP. The military leadership almost completely escaped punishment, but the civil and economic elite, like Hjalmar Schacht, the main organizer of the German economy during the war, continued their activities quietly. Smaller figures, such as Coco Chanel, who collaborated with German intelligence, were skillfully hushed up. There are often accusations against Nuremberg, considering it a political farce, and thereby arguing that no one was actually punished. In reality, the opinion of modern lawyers is that, given the scale and unprecedented nature of the process, the participants in the Nuremberg trials did the maximum that was in their power. International law, international courts, and the UN are terms that began their history from this very process. By that time in history, there was no such process of this magnitude. It should also be taken into account that jurisprudence is an extremely complex area that requires clear facts, precedents, and laws. What seems to be a violation to a person may be a pure thing from the point of view of the law. Thus, despite all the contradictions, many agreed that it would be worth expecting more from such a public trial as Nuremberg, given the complexity and scale of the task. In addition to the Nuremberg trials, 13 more trials were held, judged by the Americans and mainly the organizers of the Holocaust and war criminals from the territories occupied by the United States. A total of 24 people were hanged, 118 went to prison, and 35 received Nuremberg-like acquittals. A similar process took place in Tokyo, where 11 states dealt with Japanese war crimes from May 1946 to November 1948. This process was even more ambitious. As a result, 7 high-ranking members of the Japanese government were also executed.